welcome to another episode of Resting Pitch Face. So I would like us to dive into all things goals, specifically marketing goals for a business. That said, I think I'd like to detour, not massively, but slightly at some point, to talk about our approach on a personal level for goal setting at our in our business. We are, after all, a bunch of marketers. So it would be good to just throw in our experience. But I think from a marketing goals, from a business level perspective, what I'd like us to discuss really is what they should look like, in our opinion, how to set them in terms of being realistic, and then why goals, why they're so crucial to overall business success. So that's really the structure of today. Shall we get into it? I think we should. So let's focus to begin with on, I guess, a really critical question. Why are marketing goals so important to business success? So what's your opinion on where you start to think about goals, marketing goals and setting goals for business success? Why they're so important?
Well, they're important because you want to try and measure your returns on your budget primarily. Where I normally start is by asking what is important to the business when it comes to reporting into either the board or how they look at the bottom line and the P&L and work back from there, so that we can try and put something on the table that fits into their way of reporting, rather than it just being a spurious metric that is handled by the marketing team or the CMO.
Quick question on that, flip that. Is that because you've seen the other way of doing things, i.e. very, very little, if no, connection to the business?
Yeah, I think it comes from experience and, like I say, learning. And I think probably running the agency, understanding the metrics that you're after and the way of measuring it and also reporting it differs from what you would typically... The importance differs from what you would typically get, I guess.
Yeah. What do you think when it comes to that connection between the business, ultimately the business direction and the business's objectives? Have you been on both sides? Have you seen, I mean, obviously agency working with brands, but also for our own gain and our own good, we have our own marketing team. So also putting it into position of, from our experience, have you seen seamless goal setting that makes a lot of sense in your experience from starting from the business? And have you equally seen a huge void in goal setting from a marketing perspective back up to business?
I'm going to go right down to, so the level of granularity in marketing today is vast.
Mm.
But we're in the middle of an attribution problem. And I think where we have the best response is when we work with a business that understands long-term thinking and also understands that you can't measure everything.
Yeah.
As counterintuitive as that sounds for the conversation that we're having.
Yeah, it does.
You can't measure everything, but your best approach is to measure what you can, quantify what you can, but also have in the back of your mind the understanding that you can't measure literally every output. And that mindset is the right approach to building a brand long term.
How difficult have you found those conversations over the years?
97% of the time it's met with resistance, 3% of the time it's met with understanding.
What do you think that's thanks to, the resistance in particular?
The explosion in performance marketing. Marketing, I think COVID accelerated the need for businesses to be able to say, we're putting this much in, we're getting this much out, when people had nothing else to do but spend the money on things online, which was the only way you could purchase anything through COVID, which was probably that buying cycle, if we call it that, was probably 2 years, wasn't it, where people's movements were restricted. The ones that still were able to work remotely had income, didn't know what to do with it, so they bought stuff. home furnishings, clothing,
Yeah.
shopping. You were buying your food online. So performance marketing went mental because you could put money in and get money out quick, short term, quick cycle. Whereas brand success, which is holistic, which is a big approach, which is a big mix, is harder to quantify but still measurable.
Yeah. What sorts of things are you seeing as the leading measurable indicators and metrics for brand today?
Well, in terms of digital, we measure share of search, which is an indicator of market share, which tracks against the bottom line, which as a conversation and as a practice, in my opinion, is the best way of having long-term quantification of brand growth. And if your brand is growing, it will follow the same trend against your bottom line. No brand that is growing is having a decline in bottom line revenue.
Yeah. Brand growth then, and you gave a very specific example of that metric of share of search, but brand growth, should everyone be bothered about that on a brand side, within a company? That's almost a leading question into part 2 of that, which is, does everyone? So not should everyone care about it, but does everyone care about it? And is there a bit of a disconnect sometimes even internally between, I'm going to just throw it out there, marketers and non-marketers?
Not enough people place enough emphasis on that metric.
And you go back, circling all the way back to what you've just said there, does it go back to the boom of performance marketing?
100%. Digital is...
economic factors that force that.
Yeah, digital has made it transactional.
Do you think there's a problem? I'm not too sure if that's the right word, but the big thing, if that's the, that when people talk about digital and the boom of digital, there's lots of noise. There's a strong narrative about there's just so much data with that. And I think it almost goes back to, we talk a lot about, look at I think we've quoted it on an episode before, the touch points now, the number of touch points in a customer journey through to conversion is ridiculous compared to, when was it? I know it's a long time ago. Was it mid 2000s or something? As a comparison, it was 2 touch points back then, and what are we at now? Something
200 plus.
Yeah, something. Do you think that's at play here as well? Like, there's an enormous amount that we can measure. With that, touch points have just fucking exploded. Is all of that feeding this same thing that is a big hurdle of for conversations in talking at a level of brand growth, and not, well, look at all this stuff that we have to do to get someone, a new customer through the door, and with that there's a load of data and lots to measure?
Well, the problem is, because the data's almost become commoditized and it's so vast, the brand action now is to start at the end. So you're going in with all these views of click-through rate, conversion rate, AOV, cost per new customer, all this kind of stuff, and you're starting at the end. A brand doesn't interrupt its customer, it fits into its customer's life.
Yeah.
But to get into that mindset, you need to start at the start and think about the customer first and who you're trying to get to purchase.
Yeah, it's a really good way of thinking about it. And I'm presuming, again, we try to have those conversations, or we do have those conversations, but that level of resistance is, well, I was actually going to be quite negative there for a change and say, is it always going to be there? Do you feel like it's getting better, improving the difficulty, let's say, of those conversations to get people remodeling their thinking around brand?
Well, there's a couple of things that tie into that. One, the commoditization of information.
True.
Is surfacing that conversation better.
Yeah.
Then there are brands that are doing the right thing, that are talking about it. Like, I'm trying to think of some clear examples. Airbnb, probably the standout one, where they moved performance spend into brand spend, and they've measured it and it's paying dividend. And then there are like the flag bearers for that model, Rory Sutherland.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like there needs to be more content and information available around that. It was interesting when you were talking earlier, and we use the term performance marketing. There was a key period where agencies would describe themselves as a performance marketing agency. Now, when you were talking, I was just thinking, I can't think of exactly the specific agencies that I was thinking when that clocked in my head. But working backwards and thinking about today, given that there was that period where performance marketing agencies was the thing that you wanted to say to people, have they pulled away from that as a message? Is that I don't quite see as many performance marketing agencies. I'm saying this again in inverted commas, like the description of that agency. I don't really see that anymore. So again, is that helpful in the way of us pulling away from that story?
Yeah, I think the narrative is shifting, and I think using COVID as an example, the efficacy of performance is diminishing because people are thinking and being more considered about the purchases. So I think the need for a performance marketing agency is probably declining slightly.
Yeah.
From a brand perspective.
I've got a really big question here. In your opinion, so I heard what you said there, and I think we're in agreement there that, agencies jumped on, let's call ourselves performance marketing agency. We're seeing it less now. Who's that to me is almost like a bit of agencies are just constantly chopping and changing with the tides that are economic factors, etc. But ultimately, who do you see as the biggest driving force to things like that? That's a very trivial example we've just given, where like there was a performance marketing boom, and then there's not so much a performance marketing boom, and we're having a bit more easier conversations at a brand growth level now compared to a performance marketing short-termism sort of led conversation. Who is ultimately driving and forcing all of this, apart from economic factors, which obviously do? Do you see it as platforms have the biggest input into these sorts of things? Do you see, I've just said platforms, so Google obviously, do you see agencies are actually strong enough to dictate that, performance marketing is, let's say, no longer, compared to a few years ago when we said that everyone was talking about themselves as a performance marketing agency? Or do you see consumers as being the real driver behind, on a very trivial level, an agency used to call themselves performance marketing, and now performance marketing isn't being talked about as much?
No.
Can agencies truly dictate, or are we just at the mercy of?
None of this exists without consumers, be it direct or be it business.
Yeah.
None of it exists without that end consumer.
So do you see
agencies are tasked with staying in a place where it allows them to capitalize on attention? Consumers are platform agnostic. They've got that much at the fingertips that they don't really need to have loyalty yet.
Yeah.
Edging in front by even 1% in terms of brand recognition gives you a huge advantage. Because if you're going and you're thinking, I want to buy some trainers, and you're going into a market where, there's the amount of brands that are in that space that are brands that aren't a Nike or a New Balance is phenomenal. Every day there's a new trainer brand that, because the access to manufacturing, the access to selling your products, Shopify, the barrier to entry is
Yeah.
just so low.
Yeah.
So in a crowded space, having a cohort of people that have some affinity to you just gives you a huge advantage. And the epitome of it is, have you seen, it's doing the rounds at the moment, the Leo Burnett McDonald's campaign?
Yeah.
That's it. That's like the top of the mountain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely massive. One of the biggest brands in the world, McDonald's. Everybody knows McDonald's everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
It arguably one of the top 5 most recognizable brands in the world. That is the holy grail and the mindset that everybody should take. Wanting to create that much brand equity that you can deliver a campaign that is, on the face of it, just a fuck up.
Yeah. Ludicrous. Yeah.
And credit to McDonald's for letting that go through. But look at the result.
I know.
That's the power. That's what you need to be shooting for. And agencies should be having conversations with the clients around how to best place them in front of their customer, wherever that customer is.
Yeah. That was really well played, that campaign.
It's fucking unbelievable.
Yeah. So I guess we went down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but it all pins back to brand and brand goals in particular, and obviously focusing on goals. I want us to have a think about what makes an effective marketing goal. So like how to start setting goals. But what I'd like to do is just get your quick reflections on how we are setting goals internally on an individual level, because I still think it stands true to us talking at a bit of a higher business level about marketing goals and that connection back into, business objectives. I think it'd be really good just as an opportunity for you to talk through the shift in particular that we've adopted fairly recently on an individual basis, a personal basis for setting goals.
So we made that change from personal development to growth management is how we sort of rebranded it, I guess. And we restructured and tried to reframe everyone's thinking in how goals are set from being things that are role profile expectations, like using you as an example, increase sales.
Yeah.
That would be, and I have seen goals in development plans that fall into that category where it's just an expectation.
I've been part of those.
So we've thought long and hard and tried to put a process in place which moves towards forcing people to think a little bit bigger, a little bit longer term. And the way that I describe it is, if you were in a job interview, what would you put on the table as a thing that you achieved in your previous role that you're proud of? And that's the way that I try and open people's minds to thinking about setting goals. And it's like, what is that North Star, or what are the 3 or 4 things that you think that you want to do in the next 12, 18, 24 months that would just make you beam?
There's something really interesting that went on when you sat, obviously you've sat down with everyone here to run them through this thought process, this new approach. And there's 1 or 2 things that you said there that I'll give you my experience of. When we first talked through this approach, because it was different to previous approaches that we've all, inherited as well from previous workplaces, for example. The first thing was like, right, goals. And actually, I think there's a reason why we're talking about goals on this episode. Is sometimes they're not that easy to set, and they do need some serious thought. And I think you are the shift in the process internally here that you've just talked through is proof of that. Like there has been some thought from your side of things that a shift is needed, because 1, they're important, and 2, because they're important, they sometimes come with a little bit of either trepidation or uncertainty, from either the setter or anyone else involved or impacted by someone's goals or a business's goals. So the first thing to flag for me is there is evidence, that is perfect evidence, that goals can be, as I said, quite a difficult navigation of an exercise to navigate, really. The second thing is, and it's something that I want to sort of discuss as well in a little bit more detail, is with that approach, where does the sort of emphasis then go? Who does the emphasis then go to? Well, it's the person. Obviously, we're talking on a personal goal setting basis here, but it's back on the person. And I think we talked about right at the beginning the connection between businesses, marketing goals, back into what ultimately the business's objectives are. Now, flipping that and thinking about what we've just discussed on a personal level, how it operates here, there is no better feeling for how you just described as like, I think your guidance on like, if you were to walk away and be in a job interview, where do you immediately go in terms of an achievement? That's a great word to define what we're trying to aim for from a goals perspective. And actually, why shouldn't a brand be thinking in the same way? Like achievement, not just sort of almost on a tactical, smaller level, almost like you've just said, an expectation really level. Why shouldn't you think on a bigger scale? And actually, not to sort of keep going back to the same point, but thinking about setting brand goals for a business from a marketing perspective, that shouldn't be almost like a North Star. But then when you use the example of McDonald's and getting your brand into a position where you can do that, like licensed to do that, that feels North Star, but that feels achievement level. Whereas goals inherently from past experiences, etc., pre this shift that we've taken internally, they just can feel really disconnected, not motivated. You can't see yourself in that goal as well. And I think that's really important. And I actually think that some businesses previously that I've had experience with, marketing goals are set by the business and not marketers, and therefore there's no direct, well, there's no committee, there's no understanding, there's no buy-in from marketing back into those goals, and ultimately they're just set from non-marketers with no real understanding. And I would probably say, based on what we were talking about before, how many of those would be brand-led goals that would be set by a business with that disconnect?
But then that probably is driven by the pressure from the C-suite and the commercial pressure to hit growth when they're putting budget in.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moving parts to it. I think the common thread is what's important to you.
Yeah.
On a personal development perspective, when we're talking about goals and how we do goals, what's important to you? For a business and a marketing goals perspective, what's important to you? But it's hard to get to that.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, personally, as I said, I think it was met with like, okay, this is great, where we own that and we have set that goal. I feel I've been in places before and I've seen, even in this role, when I'm speaking to brands outwardly, that I feel like people come with goals that they don't own themselves. No, sorry, they've been given ownership, but they haven't created them. They haven't thought them through. They haven't started, at least, with them.
And oftentimes, if that's the case, it can be demotivating.
Yeah. So they're
working the complete opposite way.
Yeah, completely at loggerhead. So there's something specifically I would like to just throw your way. And we've loosely touched upon it in what we've talked about so far, but how quickly things have changed and can change and do change in our world in particular, but in marketing, let's say. How do goals fit into something that is, in your opinion, how should goals be thought about? I'm obviously thinking immediately in black and white here, like timings around goals and milestones and things. How would you want to see a brand's marketing goals set, let's say, on day one, knowing that the factors either in control by the brand or out of their control, i.e. economic factors, can just chop and change and throw your goals basically in the bin within, 1 quarter, for example. So how would you think about goals based on that as a backdrop?
I think you've got to break it into short-term and long-term thinking, first of all, because there are things that you're going to be able to achieve quicker than others, but also there are things that are probably going to be a good barometer of whether what you're doing is valid or not in the short term and in the long term. But I think if you're to zoom out, surely the conversation needs to be, is our brand growing healthily? Yes.
What if people don't know how to answer that?
Is it as a result of what we're doing? Are we the protagonist for that growth? Yes.
Yeah. So do you see really marketers and marketing teams need to get themselves into such a confident position to answer those questions with evidence?
I think it's tough to have those conversations and not be met with skepticism because of the performance element.
Yeah.
Like all marketing is performance based generally.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to achieve an outcome. But worrying about your granular metrics and making them the focal point sometimes I think stifles the performance and the capability of being creative enough to deliver the bigger gains.
Yeah.
I think you almost stifle your capability and you put a ceiling on what you can achieve because you fixate on the goals that aren't relevant. They mean something. Like I said at the start, you measure what you can.
Yeah.
And you have access to so many metrics that you can measure, but what's important to you?
Yeah. And also there's that whole thing of like goals for goals' sake or metrics for metrics' sake. And I think if you can't track something, but be then put on the spot by someone else who says, but so what? And you can't answer that based on whatever the goal is or the metric is, then you've got a problem.
Look at the Solo Stove campaign.
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
Sales.
Phenomenal campaign.
Yeah.
Didn't deliver the sales, allegedly, in the short term.
Yeah.
The immediate...
Yeah, there's a lag here as well.
The immediate gain wasn't seen. I mean, optics, you don't, in my opinion, launch a campaign like that in peak summer when people aren't going to be buying that product. But, I mean, there's a lot of other bits and bats that contribute to it. However, the campaign itself delivered brand growth, coverage, and I would suspect that from October to March, there'll be an uptick in sales. And I'd probably be interested to go back in March and
run that
analysis. I'm sure it will get done. But that resulted in, I think, did the CEO get sacked for that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, fuck. I'm sure VML, when they were selling that campaign in, were like, we want to achieve brand growth and coverage. We think this is going to deliver it. And every single person knows about that campaign. The brand mentions, coverage, it was fucking mental. It delivered what I fully anticipate VML had set out for it to deliver.
Yeah.
Yet the CFO and the commercial pressure versus the investment that was probably put in didn't hit the immediate expectation.
I've seen it before as well, that you can have everybody in the room agreeing, but when there might have been, or, you know, I'm going to include, for example, CFO, CEO, whoever in that, based on this story, you can have everyone around the table and agree from day one what the goals are to everyone's face, but it just crumbles when that door shuts and you go your separate way and then you actually get moving. And I feel like sometimes brands are forced to feel like, well, we've got this far with this agency, like it all sounds great, but I'm going to keep it to myself that it has to actually drive sales. Won't have that outwardly, have that conversation. And it is just the nature of dynamics of relationships sometimes that you can do your best to get round them. But you could still have silent assassins in the way of exactly that, someone who's retaining an absolute desire or demand, should I say, for sales in that instance, but you just don't get the opportunity to navigate that up front.
But that's new customer focused.
Yeah.
And I think, whilst valid, and yes, you want new customers, making sure that you're engaged with your existing customers is an unlock for growth. Like this new customer performance marketing focus it works, but it's short term.
Yeah, it's hard as well. Platforms.
Yeah.
We talked about something there that I just want to round off before we move on to our this or that. Agencies and brands. What do you see as the best case scenario? A brand's knocking on our door and says, can we have a conversation? Marketing team. Do you want them to come with defined marketing goals, or do you want, as an agency, the opportunity to define them together? Or do you not see a problem with one or the other? Because obviously I know there's nuance, but just in as black and white as possible. As an agency, starting a new relationship with a new client, do we want to set those goals together, or are you happy to hear what marketing have set and it's almost like a here's your assignment agency?
It comes back to the same question: what's important to the brand? And I think you're going to get, like, an agency will measure everything that they can possibly measure, and they will probably report on that because it gives them the capability of being in a process where they can then know what levers to pull if performance is tricky or if it's doing well, and there'll be a connected action to that performance, which means it's just a steering, it's navigation for the strategy. So that will happen anyway. It's about arriving at a point where what's being reported and shown to the brand and the client translates internally. When they get it, are they looking at it and going, fuck yeah? Or are they going, generic, meaningless?
Good. All right. Well, that was all about effective marketing goals. So if anyone's listened and struggling, wants to pick our brains a little bit more, hear a little bit more maybe about how we're setting personal goals as well, just for their own knowledge, more than happy to help out. So just give us a knock on the door or whatever. Make sure everyone's subscribing that's listening to hear more from us, and thanks for tuning in.